Hello, and welcome to Spotlights. This is the podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And this week, I'm really happy to welcome onto the show Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter. Chris, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much for making time for us. You were one of our first guests when we started the podcast, and it was a very different format. We were doing little, very short things where people were just kind of giving brief introductions to their work. And so, for people who don't recall that ancient episode from like almost 2 years ago, you are an assistant professor of theology and religious studies at the University of San Diego, and also on the board of directors of Farm Forward, an anti-factory farming nonprofit. That sounds really interesting. I want to hear more about that. And you're a commissioned elder within the United Methodist Church. And one of the things I really want to talk to you about today, especially, is you have a new book out, The Spirit of Soul Food: Race, Faith, and Food Justice. And which, I don't know, there's a lot. I grew up in Texas, so soul food is around. And but I know a little bit about you, and that you're not a big meat eater. And so one of the things I really like about this book, one of the best opening lines from a book, I did not want to write this book. And so I think let's start with that. Why didn't you want to write the book?
Well, thank you for saying that. I when I wrote it, I didn't think I was doing anything profound or saying anything or writing anything particularly profound. But I will say that has been a good line, in as much as pretty much almost everybody's been like, "Hey, that's kind of a weird way to start a book." I was just being honest, and that's kind of what I was trying to do. But really, at its core, I I knew that if I was going to engage this particular topic and I was going to talk about soul food, which is something that's so sacred, quite honestly, to the Black community, that, and I was going to talk about reimagining it in a way that was more plant-based, that was going to cause a lot of feelings to come up and pushback.
Yeah.
And I was not even say put, but just it was going to be a very emotional topic.
Hmm.
And I think coming from my background, just briefly, so I grew up, I'm a first generation college student. My grandfather was a migrant picker. Like, he didn't learn to read till he was an adult, didn't really go to elementary school. My mother just graduated high school. I wasn't expected to go to college. My parents worked at factory jobs, and that's what I was expected to do. I'm from West Michigan.
Hmm.
That's kind of what everybody does. There's nothing wrong with that. Like, I
Right.
would totally be a factory worker or a carpenter if that happens to be the path I decided to choose. And so I dealt with a lot of growing up. I dealt with on one hand, people basically suppressing how smart I was, in part because I didn't want people to think I was trying to act white or do that kind of, there's a lot of that was coming up in terms of, oh, you think you're smarter and better than everybody else, because of course, because of racism, white supremacy, people associate intelligence with whiteness, right? Particularly even people of color. And then when I got to the academy, I really struggled, on the other hand, even within Black religious communities, because coming from a really different class background. I come from again, a really, really poor background, and not necessarily feeling like I fit in there as well. And so this seemed like another way in which I was further marginalizing myself. and as someone who really is an extrovert who loves being around community, or values community, I should say, this was risky. And I think my first version of the book, I did not, it was very, very different. It was much more ethical in terms of its approach. I laid out an argument and then laid out all the data pointing to why my argument was correct. And then when I got to the end, I was like, this is why I'm right. And so therefore you have to accept my answer, right?
Right.
And that, is really triggering for people. That's the review. The reviews basically said that. And so I just took a step back. I was like, okay, how about I meet people where they are, where I am, and just talk about, compassion. And for me, I would say, decolonial theory or decolonizing principles and compassion really are the two guiding principles throughout the entire book.
Mhm. That's great. Yeah, that's a beautiful way to put it. Yeah, no, my wife, who Kimberly Carfor, she had a kind of experience of going vegetarian, and she's like a Polish grandma who's like, "No, you're eating the sausage. We're Polish. the sausage. And so it is, it's this, like, wow, that's so, when it's your cultural identity is tied up in it, then these kind of choices really do push and pull people around in pretty intense ways. Um, so I don't know. I think we got to start by talking a little bit more about like what soul food is, because like you're saying, you know, the soul part is spiritual. It's not just a culinary delight. It's also religion. It's cultural identity. And so what is soul food for folks who aren't familiar with it deeply? What is this kind of food?
Well, I define soul food as the food that is prepared by, cooked by, and influenced and shaped by um, A- African and Black diasporic culinary traditions, right? And so that's really just a long-winded way of me saying like this is the kinds of foods that has served to preserve and promote the Black community since our enslavement. Um, it's the kind of staples that Black people have been able to create when they had to basically try to make the expression is chicken salad out of chicken bleep. uh, and also at the same time, I talk about soul food as a means by which we preserve our story. And I think that is really when I hear Kimberly's grandmother saying we're Polish is what we do. That's a big part of what it is, right? This is how we tell our story of who we are. It's wrapped up in part through what we eat. And so when we're cooking the food and we're eating the food, we remember our ancestors, and that's really, really powerful. And I think that's a big part of what soul food is too, that kind of affective dimension of soul, and that I think is really powerful.
Yeah. And then some of the research going into the book was you were really looking at agricultural practices in plantations, so really digging into the dynamics of settler colonialism and the way that enslaved Africans were part of that. So I wonder if you can share a little bit about what that was like. That's I'd imagine that's very emotional material to get into, but also so many historical complexities going into it.
Yeah, I would say that was the hardest. That was by far the hardest part for me to research and write. This book was a long process. The original, I always tell my students, this book began as a final paper for a class I took in 2010. Like that
Wow.
was literally the beginning of the book when I got the idea and I wrote it. And my advisor at the time, Grace Gow, God bless her, you know, she was like, this has the makings of a larger project if you want it to be that way. And we really sat there over lunch and kind of thought it through. And when I got to the point of, so I said that to say, I've been working on it for a long time. I've been engaging different parts for years, but this particular portion took me the longest to write, even though it's not nearly as long as some other pieces, because having to read the narratives of people who were purchasing slaves and the ways in which they describe people as things, and how they would, there were pamphlets that basically described and told enslavers when to go to certain parts in different ports in Africa to buy certain slaves, depending on the kinds of crops you grew, right? So if you're going to grow rice, you wanted to go to a port in the Senegambia region in the spring to buy Africans. And it was that specific, which is on one hand makes perfect sense, because if you are a capitalist and you're thinking about you're like, oh, that makes sense. You want to be really specific so you could buy the bike product at the right time.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it was really depressing, I think, as someone who's also an optimistic person, and I believe fundamentally that people at the core of who they are is compassion, and that we are compassionate people. It really made it difficult for me to have that kind of stance toward these white people buying these Black people. And at the same time, to your point, Sam, I think it's so helpful that you helpfully illustrate. It gave me I think the language and tools I needed to kind of do my own healing around agricultural work. And I remember, when I grew up and learned about slavery, no one ever, essentially, I was taught that Black people were enslaved because we were really strong. We had high levels of endurance and could tolerate a lot of work.
Mhm.
And while that in part, there's truth in that, right? There is truth in that. The primary reason we were enslaved is because we knew how to grow the crops that they were growing in America better than the settlers. Like we did it better. Like we knew how to do it better. We were teaching them how to do things, whether it be growing crops, animal husbandry, farming and irrigation techniques. Like all these things come from an African style of agriculture that's still obvious if you actually go to Africa, right? Like this is and so I think learning that, it gave me a sense of pride, right? And a sense of, okay, like this is like we are, as the guide that I met, Dr. Ibrahim Asek from Senegal, he was at one of the plantations I was working at, and he was saying, he's like, we're an agricultural people. He's like, that's why they bought us. And so in that sense, I think it made me proud. It said like, no, we were not just dumb, physically strong people. We were really, really smart. And that, I think, opens up a lot of possibilities for how we think about what Africans or Black people brought to the development of food in America.
Yeah, I found that really interesting reading the book because I don't know, like the normal narrative is about the strength and all that kind of stuff. And I was like, oh, wow. You just all of a sudden, all of American agriculture has this totally different frame to it. You're like, oh, has a totally different, knowledge base than what we're normally taught about. So yeah, I found that just mind blowing to think about. And yeah, like you're saying, I would think that's empowering and also just totally allows us to rethink what knowledge is. Because so much of this book is about decolonizing knowledge and finding deeper sources of knowledge. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to that. Decolonialism is such a buzzword these days,
Yeah.
and it can, in different contexts, it's just like, more, people just use it as a kind of a metaphor or something. But you're really talking about, rethinking knowledge production, rethinking food production. So let's say a little bit more about decolonizing knowledge.
Yeah, thank you. It definitely is a buzzword now. And I'm happy to say that I was using the concepts and ideas around decolonial thinking before I knew exactly what it was called. So that was helpful. But essentially, I lean on the work of Walter Mignolo, and I think his work really influenced me. Um, and Ivan Gabara, like mostly a lot of Latin American scholars, in the way I try to think about decolonizing. And essentially, I'm arguing for this kind of recognition that the knowledge that's been produced since roughly the 1500s, so really roughly since the colonial encounter, is all wrapped up in the logics of colonialism, meaning this logics of a white male, like heteropatriarchal kind of supremacy. And so any knowledge that's produced and understood to be good is often presented through that lens. And so what our job is in trying to decolonize these particular kinds of sources of knowledge is to disentangle knowledge that's an accurate portrayal of, for instance, Black agriculture or agriculture in general or slavery in general versus what, borrowing from the work of Emily Towns, what she calls the white hegemonic fantastic imagination, which I love, because what she's basically saying is like, people were projecting their ideas upon Black people, upon indigenous people, upon women, white men, in order to justify their particular positions. And unfortunately, those narratives have been so persuasive. Those memories have been so persuasive. And I think I talk about in the book, one of the young people that I was trying to persuade to work in a community garden. When I asked him, he kept saying no, and I was like, I really want you to, do this. I think you'll like it. And he was like, oh, are you trying to make me a slave? And that's one of those things where it's like, man, like the idea that any kind of agricultural work is akin to slavery really fits into this broader narrative that's set around what it means, what we can do as Black people with respect to work and labor and the knowledge that we have or don't have. And so it's really about disentangling that. It's not about saying or throwing away, European knowledge as opposed to it's just not good knowledge or that there's something fundamentally wrong with it. It's recognizing that it's flawed in the sense that it's missing other knowledges, right? It's only prioritizing one set of epistemologies. I'm trying to add and put it in conversation with all these other sources of knowledge as well, to build something new, to build something different, not to go back to some kind of utopia, but to move forward in the construction of something new. And that for me is the essence of what decolonial thinking is.
Right. Bringing back these subjugated knowledges. And yeah, and the new thing you're talking about is food sovereignty, right? communities that actually have food sovereignty and justice to people in a delicious way. And so you're like, no, this is actually good. These farming practices can be empowering and they can help you and your community flourish together. I wonder if we could get a little into the religious side of this, because that's a big part of your own personal life, but it's a big part of the story here too. You really can't think about food and race in America without thinking about religion. So say a little bit about that.
Yeah, I thank you for noticing that. I think I don't know that I would have went on this journey had it not been me personally, for my own interpretation of, as Howard Thurman calls it, the religion of Jesus. Um, once I began to understand and connect the kind of experiences that my grandfather had, that I write about in the book, I've grown up as a migrant picker, in the South, with the experiences of farm workers today and factory farm workers especially. I was moved because I knew I didn't want to be complicit in that suffering. The stories of my grandfather that I learned growing up, that he told, that we learned about, whether eating, cooking, or back in his garden, as he still would call it, but it was huge. But for him, it was a garden, but it really was like a farm, but it was just a really, really big garden. Um, they stayed with me, and I realized I was like, if I'm going to be consistent, I'm actually going to say that my grandfather's suffering mattered. I don't want to eat in ways that can normalize the suffering of others. And for me, this was a theological problem. And so I was like, well, what does it mean for me to shift? How am I to go about changing it? And the reason I couldn't not talk about religion is is the tool. Christianity specifically was the tool that was used to justify the enslavement of Africans, to justify the genocide of indigenous people, right? To justify the kind of social Darwin racial hierarchy that we still have. Like, it has consistently been weaponized to justify the harm that we've done to human beings and the exploitation of our planet, right? And so, if you're going to talk about food justice, if you're going to talk about ecological justice, and fail to talk about Christianity, I think you're really leaving a huge gap in your argument. And I knew if I was going to persuade Black people especially, but people of color and white people in general, to think about food, I had to to morally think about food, to think theologically about food. I had to engage the ways in which they've been taught through our religious upbringing to believe that this kind of exploitation was okay. I had to start from the beginning. Like, this is why that interpretation is flawed, and how it's inconsistent with the ways in which I believe we're called to live if we believe we're called to live according to the life of Christ.
I know, right? It's so amazing how disparate that is, like the way that Christianity is weaponized for oppression, and then you like read the Gospels, and you're like, I think we're missing something fundamental about what Jesus was doing. And there's so much food, so much of what Jesus is doing is just eating with people. Like that's the radical kind of like, why was this guy considered so radical? It's like he would eat with people, anybody, and just build community through food. And you're like, why would that be such an affront to like imperial systems of oppression? But it is, if food is love and justice. So yeah, I think it's one of those tough things as Christians to see that kind of dual inheritance. There's the religion of Jesus, but then there's this like weaponized Christianity. So I wonder how you personally, because I mean, you're a reverend. You stayed in the church instead of just getting mad at it. Some people realize how much trouble Christianity has caused, how much violence, and they're like, I'm done. But for you, you're like, no, no, no. We're going to recover what's best about it.
I think, interestingly, it's funny, as I said, I didn't think I wasn't planning on going to college. Like, I didn't go to college until I was in my mid-20s. My wife made me because she was like, she's like, you're smart, you should go to college. I always felt like reading the Bible, and again, this is probably another sign I probably was going to be a theologian, because I would read the Bible even as a young adult more on my own, because I thought the stories were so fascinating. Because what I saw in the person of Jesus was someone who just like was always stirring up trouble, basically, and someone who was resisting empire. I didn't have the
Yeah.
language to name it that, right? But I knew this man wasn't just about like you commit a sin and I forgive you. And this whole notion of this kind of atonement where it's just his death on the cross makes everything better. I was much more interested in his life than his death, and than just his death, I should say. And so that's one strand that always kind of shaped and influenced me. And so for me, I never thought about leaving the church as much as I felt like what I was reading was always disconnected from what the church was practicing. And so I went to graduate school, I felt called to ministry to more try to get those things to be in alignment, right? It was never, I didn't go through that phase necessarily. I think some people go through where you just believe everything your pastor says and or everything your church leaders say. That's just not my, to be honest with you, my default is just to be skeptical, maybe neutral, right? When people say things, I'm like, okay, I might believe you, but eventually you're gonna demonstrate to me like what you actually believe and who you are. And I think that's really helped me. I honestly think with my relationship with religion. And so what I try to do in this book is really get back to some of the fundamental principles of what it means to be human from a Christian perspective. And so as much as I'm joking about the importance of talking about religion, I really only talk about religion in like one chapter of the whole book, like really, really do a deep dive on it. And I try to construct a new what's theological anthropology, which is just a really fancy way of saying what it means, the God-human encounter, what it means to be human from a Christian perspective that takes serious food and environmental justice. And I begin to decolonize the human person, like really just say, okay, how is our notion of what it means to be human shape the way in which we think about other human beings, non-human nature, and our relationships with God? And I realized, to me, I would say that our struggle with the disconnect we have from non-human nature and from others is wrapped up in this notion of being human that's built on whiteness and maleness and heteronormativity and this kind of capitalist framework of extractivism, and that this is a totalizing force that harms everyone, right? And so I don't try to make it sound like, oh, this is just something that Black people struggle with. Like, Sam, I'm not, I look at you, I'm pretty sure you're a white dude. I mean, you haven't told me you're white, but that's what I'm gonna guess. Like, this wraps up everybody. Like, none of us can be our full best selves when we all have to perform to this notion of what it means to be human that really isn't in alignment with what I believe our spirit tells us how we're called to live. And so I try to construct an alternative vision of, the human person based on this notion that, no being is, that basically God loves non-human nature and God loves us. So that means no one should be exploited. So if you start from there, what does it look like when you build this out, right? And again, this is not some kind of radical egalitarian society. I don't think that's possible, but it is a society where there is a non-oppressive hierarchy, right? Where I would say the relationship that I have with my 3-year-old son has helped me refine this. I'm like, I am, and more or less, I try to be in charge of him. It depends on the day. I'm not gonna lie to your listeners. But at the same time, I'm not, through my position with him, I'm not to exploit him. I'm not to harm him. Like, there's a way in which I have to honor his own autonomy, right? In the midst of this. So how do we create relationships with ourselves through this notion of self-love, with others through this notion of solidarity, and with not in the natural world, right? How do we create relationships in the natural world that builds on this notion of not exploiting unnecessarily? And so that's what I try to set out to do. And I feel like I developed a way of being human that feels more in alignment with the religion of Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that a lot. It seems so much like you get these wholesale critiques of hierarchy where you're just left with nothing other than like, well, I guess then everything has to be flattened into pure equality. And you're like, no, there's real differences out there. There's real layers to things. And it's important to have, your parents in charge of the kid. Simple kind of thing. Otherwise, imagine how our households would be run if the children are in charge. So I think
Some
that's
people,
great.
some people are really, I mean, I will say philosophers especially have gotten pushback from that claim,
Hmm.
because for them, when you're talking about any kind of hierarchy, they can't imagine a hierarchy not becoming oppressive.
Hmm.
And on one hand, I would say that, because I do believe in, theologically, I can call it sin, but I can say I do believe that people are selfish and do selfish things. There is room for people, or I should say there's room for people to do it. It's inevitable that some people will harm, but that's not um, you know, there's a way in which we have to recognize, I believe, that our goal is to pull people towards the good, to pull them towards being their best selves. And we can't essentially try to design, again, a utopia that's not realistic. And at the same time, I have been fortunate enough to study indigenous American cultures and indigenous African cultures, where there are many and much better examples of non-oppressive hierarchies that exist. And so, of course, the people I'm talking about that critique tend to be white, and their only understanding of hierarchy is the kind of European hierarchy that emerges out of, the Middle Ages, right? That comes in from a feudal system. And I'm like, there are other kinds of hierarchies that you need to explore, to acknowledge, to say that, if you create a place where people feel secure and stable in who they are, and they don't feel threatened, they don't feel the need necessarily to upset that particular kind of balance. And so it's an invitation to create community. I mean, that's to the point you said earlier. Food at its essence is about community. This is the invitation to really recreate communities that are more consistent with our best selves.
That's great. That's such a good example also of decolonizing knowledge, right? You have this European idea of hierarchy that's just this, feudal system that gets naturalized and treated as if it's human nature. And then you're like, actually just look around. Just talk to other people and you see these examples. I know definitely, here in the San Francisco Bay Area where I'm at, talk to some of the people like the Ohlone people.
Yep.
And it's like, yeah, we were a matriarchal society. The women were in charge. And you go, oh, well, that's got to be oppressive. And then you look how it operated and you're like, oh no, this is fantastic. We need to get you your land back and start listening more. So, one thing we got to talk about too along the way is Black veganism. That's such a big part of the book, and one of the really controversial things because for me, soul food is not vegan. So I wonder, but before getting into what you're doing in the book, your own personal conversion is part of that. So I wonder if you could share that with us.
Yeah. So as I was talking earlier about trying to connecting the experience of my grandfather with the experience of, interestingly, it happened in, this will be 2000, the year about that paper. AAR was in San Francisco, and this is my first time driving up the 5, and I saw everything you see when you drive up the 5 from here, and I was like, this looks like when we would drive from Michigan to Mississippi. And I was like, I can't believe this is still going on. Like, I was just like, yeah, I just couldn't believe it. And so that started it. Basically, that was like, I don't know that I want to opt into this system. Basically, I was like, I don't really want to do that. And so what I did is, it was a slow conversion. I really appreciate you saying the word conversion, because I became vegetarian in 2010 and had to relearn how to cook. Had to learn how to cook, quite honestly, because I didn't really know how to cook. At least I thought. Now I realize I didn't really know how to cook. And it really was just a process of saying, well, how can I eat in alignment with my values? And recognizing that the exploitation of nature and exploitation of animals is all wrapped up in white supremacy. And if I want to be anti-racist and I want to resist white supremacy, then I can't eat animal products anymore. And I was like, okay. And so let me set out to do that. And I was very patient with myself. Like I said, I didn't become vegan for like 5 or 6 years. And I don't have this hard and fast date where I'm like, oh, there was this day. I did immediately cut out meat. And then over time, I just kept cutting out more and more dairy, more and more, eggs or anything else. Because I knew that I was gonna have to, again, relearn how to cook. And I wanted to still at least eat in ways that felt culturally appropriate. And as I learned to make those things in more vegan ways, it became easier for me to let them go. And so, yeah, it was a long process. It was a process of learning how to cook, learning how to recreate food. I actually am friends with Bryant Terry, who lives up near where you guys live in Oakland. He's a Black vegan chef. I was just talking with him maybe 2 months ago. I told him, I was like, man, I think you like literally saved my life. Like physically, your cookbooks, like, I don't know that because I wasn't eating nutritiously. I was just eating stuff, and so I learned how to eat, through his cookbooks and other things like that. And yeah, I wish, if I was fortunate enough, I'd been able to talk to if I had thought about this before my grandmother passed away, I wish I had learned from her. I've been able to recreate some things that she made just based on taste. But she, like many older black women that I encountered, that I think I write about a little bit in the book, never ate a lot of meat, but never would have called herself a vegetarian because she would have thought that was what white people do.
Right.
And so again, wrapped up in racial politics. Yeah, so for me, it was that kind of that journey signified something that gave me compassion to not push this kind of militant veganism on people, because I just don't think that's practical for most black people.
Right. Yeah, I like that. So much of your vision throughout the book is practical. It's not just these, kind of pie in the sky ideals. Like, well, here's a perfect world. Like, well, that's not going to happen. So here's how we can be more practical about really building, food sovereign communities. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about Farm Forward along those lines.
Yeah.
What's this group about?
So I want to say one more thing about black veganism, and then I'll go back to Farm Forward,
Yep.
because I want to say a little bit more about like what that means with respect to broader communities. And so, as I said, and actually this ties into Farm Forward because they really helped me with moving towards farm food sovereignty stuff. Black veganism for me is this practice wrapped up in the practice of what I call soulful eating. So that's eating in a way that really is about the preservation and promotion of black community. It is a opting out of foods that are animal products. So it is opting into a kind of veganism. I call it black veganism because, as I said, my grandmother and other women, especially, but people in general, associate veganism with this kind of focus specifically on animal justice. And it's very narrow. And I wanted to separate the kind of veganism I'm talking about from that by signaling and signifying that it is about an intersectional veganism. It's quite honestly, it's anthropocentric, because I don't think I would have become a vegan if it was just about the animals. Like
Right.
I love animals. My wife is a veterinarian. I love animals. Anybody's listening, I have a dog. He's over here asleep right now. But for me, it was tying the construction of the human person, recognizing that what I call the human animal tension in the construction of the human person, meaning that the category as we understand it of human and the category of the animal is a racialized category, because the ways in which black people and other people of color have been dehumanized, we've been called animals when we are talked about in ways that dehumanize us. Whether in popular culture today, you still hear it, right? You hear, so these people acting like animals. And what they mean by that is they're not saying that we're like not Homo sapiens. What they're saying is we're not performing humanness in ways that they are comfortable with. And that performing humanness is wrapped up in performing whiteness in a way in which they're comfortable with. And so that category of animal, as it's been used really since the colonial encounter, really has been structured through race, right? It's really been structured through race. Or I should say it's been racialized, if you will. And so I wanted to bring that to light. I want people to eat in a way that really acknowledge the racism that's endemic to our food system, right? I would argue our food system is structurally racist, meaning that the labor that produces most of the food is particularly black and brown, but the profits don't go to those people, obviously, the vast majority of it. And so it's to bring attention to that kind of exploitation, and it's to try to opt into, so that's on one hand, so it's dealing with human bodies and people and calling out the structures of racism. And on the other hand, it's recognizing that from an environmental perspective, at minimum, being vegetarian and at best being vegan really addresses some of the most significant issues we have with climate change on an individual level. And it's one of the few individual things I think I know we can do and everybody can do, because climate change really is an issue we have to solve through policy, but everybody can do something with regards to our food waste and what we eat. And because Black people and poor people and old people actually are disproportionately harmed by the impacts of climate change, this is another way to eat that really preserves and promotes community. And so when I'm talking about Black veganism, I'm really talking about eating in a way that honestly I think is in alignment with the essence of soul food. It's allowing us to tell our story in a way that's about building up our community and passing on those kinds of legacies of knowledge, of wisdom, those stories that I think we want to be able to pass on to our ancestors. I want to pass on to my son. Where Farm Forward comes in, that they've been really helpful in funding the research. Quite honestly, they like I couldn't have been going to those plantations had I not had the finances to pay some of these places to let me look through their archives and meet with scholars and pay for my lodging and things while I was down there. So they've been really helpful with that. But they've also allowed me to bone up on some policy acumen when it comes to actually some of the things I argue for in the book are really influenced through the relationships I built through there. And they're an organization that is premised on eliminating factory farming. And so what I've been able to glean from my work with them and my argument to push communities to move towards food sovereignty really comes from trying to, as best we can, opt out of our current food system that is structurally racist and to create communities that are independent, right? That can really function in ways that we can provide for ourselves as best as we can. And particularly for people of color and in rural communities, especially, like these communities existed really up to like the 50s. So we're not really talking about like that long ago, right? Like it's definitely something we can begin to reclaim if we see this as something that's important and something that we ought to do. And so that's my argument that I make to churches, that this is a way for us to really engage our communities outside of our four walls, rather than just preaching a gospel that's about just luring people in, right? How can we serve the community? As you said, I try to be practical. I'm technically not a practical theologian, but honestly, I say I'm a practical theologian in the book. I wasn't that trained, but I think the pragmatic, person who grew up in poverty is just a very practical person, and that's never really escaping me.
Yeah, it's funny. I feel like sometimes it's not that practical to read all the practical theology. So it's like, if you're really practical theologian, you're not necessarily trained in practical theology. It's like, no, I had other stuff to do. I was being pragmatic about it. And I really appreciate that you're talking about anthropocentrism. That's been such a thing for like 50 years of environmental ethics, just attacking anthropocentrism all the time. And I'm like, well, if people really cared about people, then we would clean up our atmosphere and the rivers. We would change food production. So like, it's such low-hanging fruit to get people to care about people. Like, we can do so much with that. And I think especially because if you're only thinking about taking care of animals, then you're not necessarily going to think about getting off of industrial agriculture. And you're like, oh, that's okay. I'll just go to the frozen food aisle, get some vegetables, and I'm a good person now. I'm like, oh no, but that's still a massive problem.
Yep.
So how much of what you're doing is also just about like relocalizing food production? Is that a big part of it?
It is a big part of it. As best as we can, I think I recognize that, like, for instance, I live in San Diego. Local food production here, well, to be fair, actually, I could eat locally here, and I do eat pretty well locally because of the climate, and because we're close to the border. Let's be honest, man. Like,
Right.
like, I'm not gonna lie, like, like we get a lot of food over that border. But having relocalizing food and doing it in a way that actually prioritizes the farm workers, I think, is crucial for us to have some kind of long-term stability. What this requires, and by stability, I mean like ecological stability, like how can we actually get out of the fast track to climate catastrophe? What this requires is sacrificing being able to eat strawberries in like December. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It requires us making some sacrifices in terms of the goods that we're used to being able to eat at any time of the year. And that's such a American way of eating. That's such a developed Western way of eating. That's not the way. It's not the way most people in the world eat.
Yeah.
And we have to recognize that. And as Americans, we are a huge part of the problem with our consumption, thinking that we just can have whatever we want. And it's not, again, it's eating with the seasons is very natural. Like this is very natural. And so if I feel like people are like, you're making this big sacrifice, but in truth, it's just learning another way. It's knowledge that your grandparents probably have that you have to reclaim, right? And seeing that for what it is in terms of trying to create a society that allows us, to survive as a species. And so relocalizing food, putting the labor force, in positions where they actually can have a living wage, I think is a huge, something that I think religious organizations should be deeply involved in.
Right. Yeah, I can imagine there's such an important role for churches in the future. Like these can be the hubs around which people are building communities of food sovereignty. So it's, get out there, churches. It's
I,
such an easy point, but it's still kind of a lot of foot dragging.
yeah, I think you know, on one hand, a lot of churches, especially in urban communities, you don't really have that many people there who maybe even grew up on a farm or know anything about farming. And so they hear that and they're just like, I don't know anything about that. But I do believe that, networking and connecting with other people who do know how to grow food, using our land resourcefully, not just to grow grass. Um, and also recognizing that, if you read the climate science, which I have footnotes in the book about it, I don't try to depress people by putting it in the book. We have to recognize that our food scarcity is real. Like, it's going to be real. It's already real depending on where you are.
Yeah.
And so we need to be thinking about how we can provide for the communities and for our own community as we move forward, if we are going to continue on the path we're on with respect to ignoring carbon emissions and some of the significant issues that that's causing with respect to our planet and climate change.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good to keep it in the footnotes.
I know. I was like, it's so. I'm like, it's sad. It is the hardest part about teaching anything to do with ecology.
Hmm.
Is dealing with young people, especially, that deal with that shame and guilt wrapped up with what's happening. And I get it, man. I mean, like I said, I have a 3-year-old son, and I wonder about the kind of world he's gonna hopefully be able to grow up in. And I have my students read Parable of the Sower. So anyone listening to this who, because of that, I'm like, this is like someone's vision of what the world could be like that was written in the early 90s. That's eerily similar to what's actually happening right now. So let's think about what we're doing and why we're doing it, and opting out of it. Again, like, this doesn't, we don't have to live this way. Like, how can we create institutions that are at the service of life rather than making our lives center around serving institutions?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Man was not made for the law, right? The law was made for man.
See, you can bring it always back to the text, man. Bring it all back to the text. So I appreciate it.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, and I mean, we're, both in California where the drought has been so severe. So I mean, this is really bearing down on us and on farmers and at the same time, you think of the history of this, like the American Southwest. It's been pretty dry, and indigenous people knew how to have sustainable and tasty food. And so there are ways. We just need to, be connected to the land. I like that, especially eating seasonally is one of those things. Like, I know it might feel like a sacrifice to not have strawberries in December. The benefit is now you feel connected to nature's cycles again. And so you're part of something bigger than yourself and not just this, I don't know, lonely, alienated consumer. So ultimately, I think, it feels like a sacrifice at first, but then there's this big reward that comes of being part of community, being part of nature.
And you're probably eating something that you otherwise had not eaten, a fruit that can grow in that time of year, and reconnecting again with the kind of way in which perhaps your ancestors ate or other ancestors ate. I think this gets to the point you made about anthropocentrism that I want to make sure I make clear. Um, while anthropocentrism is helpful in terms of thinking about what they're calling the Anthropocene, at its core, it's really addressing what I would say we need to be clear who we're talking about. We're talking about kind of, again, a white capitalist, heteropatriarchal framework. We're talking about that's the Anthropocene. Those are the people who are causing the massive amounts of global climate change. It's the corporations. It's people who make billions of dollars. That's who we're talking about. And so, yeah, if you want to critique that, you need to be very specific.
Yeah.
Don't say things like it's the Anthropocene or this is about anthropocentrism. No. There are certain kinds of ways people are practicing being human that ultimately harm other human beings,
Yeah.
right? Call that out. Instead of using a kind of language evasion and trying to make it seem like it's a blanket statement on all human beings, let's just be really, really specific about who's doing this. And why won't they do that? Well, because there's usually white people who feel uncomfortable naming white supremacy, naming sexism, naming patriarchy, naming capitalism as one of the fundamental flaws that's gotten us to this point. And I think unless and until we begin to do that, to really recognize that, again, it's not anthropocentrism as such, it's that our fundamental assumption of what it means to be human is wrapped up in an oppressive way to be in the world. And I would argue until we redefine that, we are going to be continue to make the same mistakes. That's why I don't argue for being human. I don't, in the sense of, I don't think it's helpful from a Black perspective to respond to when someone says, "Oh, you're just an animal," to respond by saying, "Oh, I'm a human too." I'm like, no, that category of human is messed up. Like, that's not what we want to be, right? Like, I don't want to be equal with the oppressor. I want to dismantle the systems of oppression, which means I have to reimagine what it means to be human outside of this framework. And so again, I think it's looking to those indigenous folks as human beings, humanizing them and saying, well, how did they survive in this place? And maybe there were less of them here, which ultimately does mean that maybe some of us are going to have to move. And you know what? That's likely. And thinking about that ahead of time, rather than trying to think about it and pretend it's not going to happen, I think we would be very wise to do so. But again, I'm trying to be pragmatic and practical. Telling people in San Diego, may not be the best place to live on this coast, or New Orleans, where my mother's side of the family lives. That's tough. I love New Orleans, but that's not a place you should live right now. Like, it's not, and it's sad, but the reality of the situation is, unless we make fundamental changes to how we are living on this planet, we're going to lose some of these spaces, and we need to make those shifts.
Yeah. Yeah, I really appreciate that, practical and optimistic, even in the face of really immense challenges. And that tone really comes through in the book. It doesn't, there's some environmental writing, though, it just feels so bogged down in how bad it is. And you're like, no, you're facing that, but there's just like, yeah, well, we can do this, we can do this. And if this doesn't happen, then okay, then we're probably gonna have to move. And it's just, yeah, I don't know, it's a refreshing tone. I appreciate it, because stuff, I haven't finished it, but the stuff I've read so far, it feels just, I don't know, I guess hopeful might be the word, or courageous, old virtues, those kind of things.
I am a virtue ethicist, and so yes, those are definitely in there. I think that we need to talk about cultivating a kind of resilience, and quite honestly, Sam, I think most Black people in America are very resilient because we've had to be to survive. And and part of the reason I talk about race in the book is, white people have to develop the kind of resilience that marginalized communities have had to develop. And that takes intention, but it totally can be done. And so there's no reason to not be hopeful. We have all the tools we need to address the problem. It's, do we have the will to address the problem? And so I'm about just trying to persuade people, to pull people towards the good, not to force it. You can't make anybody do anything. Long term, we have to persuade people that this is the way to go, and this is a better way, and you'll be happier if we do it this way too, if you lean into it.
Nice. Beautiful. Okay. Can't end on a better note than that. We'll leave with the happiness. That's a great thing. And geez, I don't know, I could talk to you forever. We'll have to have you back sometime to chat more. Really doing great work. It's just always inspiring and illuminating. So thanks so much for making time for us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Sam. I really appreciate being on.
All right. Well, we'll be back next week with some more conversations for you. And in the meantime, take care and be well.